And joining us now on the debate in Melbourne, Australia, via Skype, Steve Lillebuen, journalist and author of The Devil's Cinema, about the case of killer Mark Twitchell, who was inspired by the TV show Dexter. In Wilmington, North Carolina, Eric G. Wilson, author of Everyone Loves a Good Train Wreck. And with us here in studio, Stephen Mazzotti, Associate Professor of Sociology at Ryerson University in Toronto, and Romaine Smith-Fullerton, Associate Professor of Information and Media Studies at Western University in London, Ontario. Good to have everybody, both here in the studio and in Points Beyond, on our program today. Steve, I want to start with you first in Australia, because these numbers, well, I won't characterize them. I'm going to ask you to do that. More than 300,000 people watched the video of the murder of Lynn Jun. That's the Magnotta case that has been all over the world over the last couple of weeks. More than 800,000 watched the Miami face-eating video. And I want to know off the top, do those numbers shock you?
At one point I think they did, but I think it's just we've entered a world where people have this complete access to any kind of material they want on the internet. And I think just that morbid curiosity that people have is, drawn them to be attracted to these things even more. And because things can go viral now, you can, push notifications to people through Twitter and stuff like that. Even, snuff films or the most grotesque videos ever can become just as viral as all the other stuff we see on the news that gains popularity through the internet.
Stephen, that's more than 1 million people watching those two quite grotesque videos. Does that surprise you?
Not in the least. What I find surprising is that there aren't more people watching it.
You're surprised there aren't more?
Absolutely.
Why?
We have been so separated from death for so long now that we crave it, we seek it out, and obviously the dominant medium is the internet, and this is where people are going to find it.
Eric, why are we so interested in this kind of awful stuff?
Well, there are actually many reasons why we're morbidly curious. I think the most basic one is when we view violent behaviors, whether they be fictional or non-fictional, our pulse rate goes up, our body releases chemicals, we get a real rush, titillation. But I think certainly it goes beyond that. I think probably in a case of watching a violent crime, we probably feel somewhat satisfied to be able to join in a large community of people doing the same thing. We often feel isolated in our overly technological world, and we often feel confused in an ambiguous world. So suddenly we feel connected with all these people expressing moral disdain over this heinous crime.
You want to add anything to that list, Romaine?
I completely agree, because I think part of what crime stories and crime coverage gives us is an opportunity to unite in communities. I think it's pretty easy for people to line up on one side and say that's completely disgusting, that's abhorrent behavior, I'm shocked and outraged, in a way that they can't do around, say, a financial story or even an education story.
Sounds like you're putting a bit of a positive spin on this, though, that we are united in our outrage for this, therefore we are going to consume an awful lot of it. But it sounds like there's a prurient side to this as well. Isn't that fair to say, Romaine?
There's absolutely a prurient side. So on the one hand, some crime coverage can give us an opportunity to have what some scholars call a moral workout. So you have an opportunity to test your own moral boundaries and the ways that you think and feel about things. But the downside is that we do have a prurient sensibility, and sometimes that kind of coverage can really just entice people to only look and think about things in a superficial way and not really to engage with the larger issues that lie behind crime coverage.
Stephen, this is not just an internet thing.
Yeah,
I mean, the fact is that you go back to the gladiatorial times and people enjoyed going to the Roman Forum and watching other people butchered in public. We're just attracted to this kind of horror show?
I think what it is that we have, as human beings, a connection to death, and since about the late part of the 19th century, we've been increasingly separated from death. We've entered a society of death denial. And because we're so separated from death, we seek it out in any way that we can. You combine that with some of the more vicious kind of forms of necrovoyeurism and this kind of stuff, whether it's on the internet or something on prime TV or something that's on the news, fictional or real, is not at least bit surprising.
Eric, would you agree with that we are in a kind of a denial of death in society right now, and this at least gives us some taste of it?
I would. Really, ever since the middle of the 20th century, death has become increasingly clinical. When people used to die in their own houses, people used to experience the death of loved ones directly all the time. Now people die in white hospital rooms, and then the bodies are taken over by morticians and made up to look almost as if they're alive. Certainly one would welcome that. But I do think that in our culture there is a disconnection from death, and we need a connection to death. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, says that each of us has within our psyche a shadow side, a kind of reservoir of all that we hate and fear about ourselves. We like to repress this side because we don't want to face these things about ourselves, but the shadow will out. And this is another reason I think we're so fascinated with death and destruction. We have that dark side ourselves, and when we don't acknowledge it, we often express it in ways that we're not aware of, like watching violent videos, for instance.
Well, Steve, follow up on that if you would, because I read some statistic somewhere at some point that said that the average 16-year-old is probably, if he's just an average consumer of primetime television, seen about 10,000 murders over the course of his or her life. That sounds very connected to death. Is it not the case?
Well, I think it's, I mean, death is the ultimate act, and, usually the crime section is the most read section in the newspaper, and I think it's because of the shock, and for a lot of people, they're seeking to see how they can relate to the story. Often the crime stories that I've written as a journalist focusing on crime, the ones that seem to resonate the most with the public are the ones that involve a little girl, and people can think of their own daughter, or they involve someone's husband, like the book and the case I covered with Mark Twitchell. He was just a suburban father who, lived in suburbia, was married, had a little kid, and sort of overnight he had become this wannabe serial killer. And I think because of that, who he was before, that drew a lot of people in. They could relate to the idea of just a suburban father being, and these sort of dark, I guess, interests that people have. He was a big fan of Dexter, and that's one of the most popular shows on television. It's entering its 7th season. People are fascinated about that dark side that may lurk beneath, and could I share some of those qualities that these people I'm seeing in the news have?
Romaine, you teach media studies, so I want to cover off that angle on it now. And I think if you've lived in Ontario for a couple of decades, you go back and you remember the Bernardo killings,
Absolutely.
Which were,
the biggest thing on our radar.
Absolutely, 20 years ago or so. Considerable disgust and, frankly, fascination as well with the Bernardo killings.
Yes.
There was no widespread internet then. There was lots of publication ban in Ontario, so if you wanted information about that, you either had to cross the border and go buy a paper in Buffalo or whatever.
Right.
Americans obviously weren't bound by our publication bans. How much have things changed in newsrooms since that case?
Things have gone very, very far from what initially the situation was. The Bernardo case and the coverage of that entire case really was a watershed moment for journalism and for newsrooms, because before that time, newsrooms and journalists really had to be very careful that they weren't going to cause contempt of court. So you didn't want to say or print anything that might impugn someone's guilt before he or she had their opportunity for their day in court. But with Bernardo, things changed in part because a lot of the information had already, even though it was under publication ban when Karla Homolka made her plea bargain, the journalists themselves already knew that information, even though they couldn't really let it out there. And basically people knew that he was a rapist and that he was a pretty nasty guy who had abducted two teenagers. Mm-hmm. And so this notion that he was in some sense innocent when he had his day in court was already problematic. So the journalists could write more colorful copy about him because he really had very little reputation to impugn. And once that cat was let out of the bag, it's never really been effectively put back in. So the kind of color commentary, I guess that's sort of what we would call it, the more extreme stuff, the more judgmental coverage, if you will, that's pretty common now, and really popular and widely read, walks pretty close to the line, and maybe in some instances it even traverses that line, but it's pretty tough to go back to the kind of coverage that we had before, especially when it garners so much readership.
Yeah, and Eric, our impression up here in Canada certainly is that there may be few rules about publication bans here in Canada. It's all bets off in the United States. Am I right about that? It seems anyway that there is no depths to which various media won't go in order to get an even more disgusting angle on the story than the next guy. How accurate is that?
Well, it's true, and we can think back to the horrible videos of the beheadings soon after the Iraq and Afghanistan wars began. There were websites that showed these beheadings, and the traffic was so great that the entire internet got clogged. And in fact, a whole new genre of media really grew up at that time. It now goes by the term war porn. And I really think that in America in particular, perhaps because it is so saturated by media, there is a sense that nothing is taboo anymore on the internet. Now, of course, I think that's part of the draw that most of us feel to these violent acts, is there is a taboo there. And it's kind of titillating to break that taboo. And also, I think there's a sense, as perverse as this might sound, that in watching these heinous crimes, we're getting closer to reality. One of these war porn sites marketed itself by saying, "Can you handle reality?" And some of the people who are addicted to these sites said in an interview that they feel as if they're somehow closer to the truth by watching these violent crimes. The question comes then, I mean, is there a limit? Is there a way that we can stop this sort of behavior?
Well, Steve, why don't you come in on that and tell us how, we just talked about how things were 20 years ago with one of the most notorious murder cases in Canadian history. Talk to us about how the internet has in fact changed this whole area that we're discussing tonight, both because of its speed, its availability, whatever else.
Yeah, I think you can't go back to those days where the courts kind of had their own system, and journalists would kind of respect the rules of the court, what you could and couldn't say. A lot of it because journalists don't have control over information anymore. Anyone is technically a journalist these days. They have a Twitter account, people have blogs, they can seek out this information themselves, and that's what we saw with this Magnata case, is I guess sort of newsrooms became almost secondary. Newsrooms were reporting on what people were already doing. They were finding the video themselves online. They were finding Magnata's blog. They were talking about all these things without the journalists themselves being involved in the story whatsoever. So, yeah, it's completely changed it, and I think courts around the world are struggling what to do with that when sort of this hyperspeed is built up with major cases, and just the amount of commentary that gets flooded on the internet. We saw that with Casey Anthony in the States, where that became a running story for months while she was still on trial, and then when she was acquitted, of course, the amount of outrage that was propelled from that because it had been such a huge news story for so long.
And I guess, Romain, the coming full circle on this internet angle, Magnata was found in a bar on the internet, checking himself out.
Right. Because
How gross is that?
It's a bit gross, but it seems really a part and parcel of today's culture. I think when we were talking earlier about people's fascination with death, I think it's just a more extreme version of the way that a lot of us are choosing to live our lives now. We don't feel like we are alive unless our lives are constantly mediated for us. We need to see ourselves reflected back at us on Facebook, through our words on Twitter, constantly taking photographs and uploading them of ourselves. We're not having a great time unless we can see that we're having a great time. And that's a really big, I think, psychological shift that we've made, and that's a fairly recent shift.
Two pieces of business I should mention here. Number one, internet cafe, I think, not a bar. That's number one. Or if you want to join us on Twitter, hashtag Agenda Chat, chime in, join the conversation as we are both doing this program on air and online. Stephen, let me get you in on this one. Does the level of saturation, in your view, reflect a demand for this material or create a demand for this material?
I don't think there's an easy answer to that. If I can play on what Romain had just suggested, I think that the kind of narcissism that's tied to a late modern consumer culture has a lot to do with the amount of traffic these websites are getting. It has a tremendous amount to do with it. And it's also connected to the kind of brutality and really kind of dehumanization of other human beings. So other human beings' sufferings, and as a matter of fact, nothing about other human beings really matter. What matters is us, and hence their suffering simply becomes a heinous spectacle for us to consume.
I know you're all on the program today to analyze this, but Eric, let me start with you on this. Is anybody prepared to say, this is just wrong, this is bad, we shouldn't be looking at this stuff? Eric, start us off.
Well, I'm prepared to say that intention has everything to do with it. If you're watching these heinous videos only to get physical titillation, a sick thrill, and that's that, then certainly you're reducing someone else's suffering to commodity. You are dehumanizing that person, and obviously that's wrong. And I think there's something that should be said here. I think that oftentimes non-fictional renderings of violence put us in this position because we really don't have any kind of imaginative buffer to distance us from the brutality of the crime. I do think, though, that one could possibly approach watching.
No, we've had our satellite freeze up there, but pick up on that, Stephen, if you would. Are you prepared to say that anybody who consumes this ought not to? It's wrong.
I think that I would be prepared to say that. I mean, we're exercising a moral judgment in seeking this sort of material out, particularly when we're talking about things like Magnotta and some of the other things that are on these death porn sites. We are not. This is not the Kennedy assassination. Okay, this is not Neda Zoltan. Okay, these are not the same sort of political messages in these images of death that you're getting on some of these internet death tourism sites. What you're getting are the kind of banal, vicious titillation. And yes, I think as consumers we have a moral responsibility to say that we're not going to go there. We're not, and we're going to exercise the gospel of the pocketbook.
And just understanding, when you say it's not the JFK assassination, you mean it's not historically important footage?
No, we're not about the historical importance of the Zapruder film or General Locke's execution of the civilian or something of that sort.
Okay, Romain?
And I think it's become a way, too, for citizens in a democracy to distance themselves from their own responsibility for participating in this kind of culture that creates and glorifies certain types of behavior. And it seems incredibly problematic that in a democracy where we ought to be weighing in on ways in which our citizens conduct themselves and thinking about our own roles within that society, instead of doing that, we just get some kind of superficial titillation from the, as Steve said, the kind of the cheap thrills of the videos, and not really engaging in the larger issues that crime coverage really ought to be bringing forward and largely can't and doesn't.
Steve, I should get you to weigh in on that question too. Is this wrong, and would you tell people not to watch it because it's wrong?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, a lot of this material used to be suppressed for the courts or handled. It was only detectives, courts and jurors after a lot of preparation who would have to watch this kind of material. And now it's online with it just being thrown out there. I think, though, a lot of people they didn't understand what they were watching with the Magnotta video. I remember reading a lot of comments. People were asking, "Is this real?" I think there is an element when it's online that there is a separation. People do act differently online. We see that with cyberbullying. People say things on the internet that they would never say in, the quote-unquote real life. And I think maybe now that it's become so clear what that video was. I think a lot of people would regret what they had done and they had actually watched something that was so horrific, that was a real man's last moments. And it is wrong. That kind of material I don't think should be on the internet.
Stephen, I want to follow up with you because the JFK video, the Zapruder film, let's say, I'm not sure you're going to get any argument about the historical significance of seeing an American president gunned down in public. That's pretty clear. This one might not be so clear. Daniel Pearl, Wall Street Journal reporter, in a war zone, captured, beheaded by terrorists. That's out there. What list does that go on?
I think it's a lot closer to the Zapruder film and the Locke execution and Neda Zoltan's being shot by the sniper than some of this other stuff that's on the internet death tour and some sites.
So that does, you think, meet the threshold of being historically significant footage, that it's not considered sort of snuff footage or whatever else you want to say?
No, it's not snuff footage.
Okay. Romain?
I think you're right, Stephen, because I think what Daniel Pearl was doing was providing a larger function, serving a role. And I think that needed to be documented, and what happened to him and the ways in which he was treated needed to be documented so that people could understand what a journalist was putting at stake in order to tell the stories that he was prepared to tell.
Horrific, though.
Horrific.
Steve,
Horrific.
go ahead.
I think one thing I would say too is a lot of these kind of graphic and gory footage they really depend on context. And I think that's what happened that was wrong in the McNaughta video, is that all context is stripped away online, and really any kind of real story can be told in a respectful, analytical way, which does make it appropriate. But it's when the material is completely stripped out, and it really is just reduced to this is a 3-minute clip of gore, that I think people have a problem with. But then that's, the whole story isn't told. It is just titillation. It is reducing real people into just a cheap thrill.
I should let everybody know we are trying to relatch to Eric in North Carolina, but obviously we're having some satellite issues. I don't want you to think that I'm ignoring Eric. We're just having trouble getting him back. So Steve in Australia, start us off on this one. Snuff flicks, execution videos, Dexter, the TV show you're well aware of, horror movies, I think of the Saw franchise, which is up to what now? 5, 6, 7, Saw, I don't know, 7, Saw 7? And that is really brutal stuff. I mean, that's disgusting stuff. But is there a categorical divide in your mind between real crimes and fictional ones?
Yeah, I think it used to be a lot more clear. I remember growing up, even crime shows, even just putting blood on television was an issue. And but we could really enter crime stories when it was fictional. But I guess what's happened now is that crime stories have become more and more extreme, and the graphic nature of them becomes more and more extreme. We even just seen that with say Law and Order. Some of the stuff they'll show on prime time is they wouldn't have shown 20 years ago when the show started. And I think now what's happened is now it's merging a bit online, where you now have that separation of what is real and what isn't very clear. And even some films and some fiction plays off that theme of, is this real or not? It's sort of this, documentary style horror is, quite popular. So I think it's the lines are really blurred now. And I think that's why, I guess these videos can become popular, because there is that doubt that people have that, oh, maybe it isn't real, maybe it is, and there's that ambiguity that just draws people in.
Eric, I'm not sure you could hear me. I think we've got you back now, but we do have snuff films and execution videos and Dexter and horror movies. I wonder whether you, in your mind, make a categorical differentiation between real crimes and fictional ones.
I think there is actually quite an important difference. And I would say it has to do with what I'll call aesthetic distance. If one sees a real crime committed, there often is no buffer. There's no sort of defense mechanism in the mind to separate us from that and make it meaningful. I think that these more sort of historically significant acts of violence, like the Kennedy assassination, as horrible as it is seen as a kind of meaningful act that opens us up to thinking about all sorts of very important issues. But I think this is precisely what art can do. You take Greek tragedy or Shakespearean tragedy. It takes violence to yet another level of context. And ultimately, if you watch, say, King Lear and see the horrific suffering there, I think you can start thinking about violence as a site of meaning. We start wondering, well, what's the meaning of suffering? What's the meaning of death? And ultimately, I think we should feel empathy for those who suffer. And I think this is what artistic renderings of violence can do that non-artistic renderings of violence cannot do. Artistic renderings of violence ideally open us up to empathy, invite us to imagine what it feels like to suffer, invite us to transcend our egos and try to connect with another person in trying to feel what they're going through.
Stephen, would you make that differentiation as well?
I think there's a differentiation. I wouldn't agree with that characterization of it, though. I mean, I think that the blurring of lines between reality and entertainment, or news and entertainment, have become increasingly fuzzy. And as such, the kind of images that we're getting are not only kind of mirroring each other, but really kind of playing off each other in almost some sort of very, very destructive media loops.
Makes a good point about King Lear, though. It's hard to watch King Lear without feeling, now mind you, that's Shakespeare, but it's hard not to have sympathy for what happens to this old guy, even though some pretty awful stuff happens to him. You're not sold, though?
Well, I think what we're talking about, King Lear, and what we're watching on, the latest formulaic cop show, and what we're watching on the internet, they're considerable differences. Well,
that's a fair point, too. Now, 50 plus years ago, Alfred Hitchcock, Romaine, made Psycho in black and white, because the studio told him, you can't show that kind of gory red blood going down the drain. It'll freak audiences out. we're we're a million miles away from that now, aren't we?
We are. But we're in a space now where we do kind of need that mediation, and we've acknowledged that virtually everything about our existence is constructed. So if we have buy-in to the notion that life is a construct, then how do you get back to actually experiencing anything? Well, clearly you have to come up with a construct that makes it seem more real.
Mm-hmm. Steve, you know, I'm sure you've been asked this question before, but I'm going to ask it again. The guy you did the book on watched a television show about a crazed killer, you know, who's sweet on the outside and looks nice and all of that, but at the end of the day, brutally murders people, and then went out and did it. How much responsibility do people who make TV shows, do audiences who enjoy TV shows, all of that stuff, our fascination with killers, how much responsibility do all the rest of us have to bear because of what happened?
Yeah, well, I think that's a question that you can ask of a lot of crime stories. Definitely, you know, Hollywood's it's quote unquote inspired a lot of killers out there, all the way back from, you know, Charles Ng and even this Magnotta case. Apparently, there's links to Basic Instinct. But you're right with the Mark Twitchell case. He had become obsessed with Dexter and had actually emulated him in his crimes and replicated elements of the show in real life. I always say though that it's I guess these kinds of shows, they tend to focus dark fantasies as opposed to create them. So, you know, these people are out there, and obviously they're going to have their own, you know, they're going to look at things a bit differently than, you know, you and I, at least you would hope so. And, you know, they're drawn to these shows maybe for the same reasons we are. But then what they get out of them is very, very different, and it's sort of has an amplifying effect of maybe something that may be disturbing or wrong already pre-existing in their lives.
Stephen, what do you think on that?
I think we need to be very careful about suggesting that because somebody goes out and watches one of these videos that they are then, or a program or what have you, and then are going to go out and act on it. I don't think it's anywhere near that simplistic. Human behavior is extremely complex. Deviant or transgressive human behavior is even more complex. So to suggest a simple cause and effect relationship, I think this is I think this is short-sighted. It's not particularly useful, and it's really kind of the imperative of right-wing politicians.
Oh, all right. We're going to take a shot at them while we're at it, eh? Okay. Well, having said that, obviously millions of people have watched Dexter, and millions of people have not gone out and replicated that which he does every week on television. Having said that, I don't know, Romaine, is there some responsibility that the people who watch these shows and presumably fuel the fantasies of the very rare bad seeds in our society who then go out and do these things, you know, is there any responsibility there at all?
Well, I think everybody bears some responsibility for what goes on in his or her community. So in that sense, yes, of course. But the way to initiate that discussion, or the way to control the behavior of a few problematic people, isn't also to ban all crime coverage or to ban all you know, reality shows or even completely constructed shows about crime.
No one's saying that.
That would be pretty extreme. So responsibility, sure, but how is it that we're going to acknowledge our responsibility and participate in debates about how to better raise children and be a kinder group of people? I don't know. That's also an enormous topic.
Yeah, nobody's saying you know, don't cover this or don't cover that, but can we dial it down a bit? Is that possible?
It's possible, but I think right now, especially when money is the issue, certainly for mainstream media, the reason that so many newspapers want to cover the extreme details of crime is because, frankly, it gets a lot of hits on the website. Nothing generates, you know, more page views and visits than some crime coverage will generate for you. So when the competition is so cutthroat and media is, you know, fighting tooth and nail to survive, I think it's not realistic in the present system that we have to expect it to be otherwise.
Steve, are we spitting into the wind in the hopes that the people who make these movies, television shows, online products, etc., might just dial it down a tad, just to you know, abide by community standards that might have been a little more kind and gentle in older days? Is that possible?
I don't think so. I think the interest is there. People people, devour this kind of content, and they have a fascination with this kind of content. I think getting back to the point, though, about bearing responsibility, I will say this. I do think we do bear some responsibility in this Magnotta case, is that a lot of people didn't realize that his video was put out there for a reason, and by watching, people do feed into this persona, or I guess the ideology and exactly what the murder suspect was wanting. He wanted an audience. He's been given a direct access and direct audience. So I think some people do, that sort of thought process doesn't occur to people when they just click on a link. But that's sort of an opportunity we have now that, that material is still on the internet. We do have an opportunity to not seek that out and not feed into exactly, I guess, the monster that was being created.
Eric Wilson, is there any hope in dialing down some of the truly gruesome stuff that we see on television or in the movies these days?
I don't think there is until we, as a culture, really redefine what we mean by celebrity. I think probably if you look back to the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a sense that someone who was a celebrity was admirable in some way, had some worth to his or her culture, a great leader, great artist. Now in our culture, saturated by media, to be a celebrity just means to be watched by a lot of people. So suddenly now you have serial killers or people committing gruesome crimes knowing that if they post their crimes on the internet, they will become for a time a celebrity, almost like a movie star or a rock star. Perhaps the problem is with capitalism. As long as people are willing to consume these videos, as long as people are willing to treat murderers as celebrities, then I don't think the violence will be dialed down at all on the internet. If anything, it'll continue to grow.
So community standards, this notion of community standards, which used to buffet back and forth between what was acceptable and what's not, it sounds like from what you're saying, the arrow is pointed in one direction and it's only going to get worse. Fair to say?
Well, I think until perhaps I still think the internet is somewhat monstrous in a way. We don't know quite what to do with it. It still hasn't been conceptualized or thought through with enough thoroughness and rigor. And I think if there is any hope of these violent acts being died down, it will be with sort of a more deliberate, thoughtful discussion of what the difference between the real and the virtual, as well as in the difference between legitimate information and pornography, war pornography in this case, violent pornography.
Stephen, I'm trying to imagine how community standards might change in this case. Is it possible that a preponderance of society could say, you know what, we've actually gone too far and this is even too gross for most of us? Let's bring it in a bit here. Can you see that happening?
Absolutely. I think that people should exercise the gospel of the pocketbook, whether we're talking about something on an internet site or something they're watching on corporately owned news. If they don't like it, I think they should let the people know that they don't like it, why they don't like it, and let the advertisers know, whether we're talking about a TV program or something that's on the internet, that they are not going to support those products being sold or those services being offered, particularly because they are underwriting this very heinous content.
Romaine?
I think we've already seen it happening. Look what's going on in England right now with the Levison inquiry. People have fought back, and they are voting with their pocketbooks, and they've been very, very vocal about some of the kinds of coverage that tabloids have been indulging in. They said that's enough.
The Sun lost basically half its readers, didn't they, on the weekend?
Yes.
Yeah. That's actually, I was going to say that's encouraging, isn't it? There is a line people won't cross.
Yeah.
They think, okay.
The line was crossed so far that people said, we need to move this back. We're really not comfortable being there.
On that very encouraging note, I'm going to bring the gavel down and say thank you, everybody, for joining us on the program tonight. Steve Lillebuen, the author of The Devil Cinema, on Skype from Melbourne, Australia. Thanks so much for being there for us. Eric G. Wilson, author of Everyone Loves a Good Train Wreck. He was on the line from Wilmington, North Carolina. I should say on the line most of the time. Apologizing for the satellite problems we had, Eric. Steve Mazzotti from Ryerson University, Romaine Smith-Fullerton from Western University in London. My thanks to you too as well.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.